Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that features distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to have the distinguished Dr. Andrew Bertoli, guest Business Talk today as our esteemed guest. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. What happens when a sports fan becomes a political scientist? You get Dr. Andrew Bertoli, a scholar who has built an entire research agenda around the surprisingly powerful intersection of athletics and global affairs. Dr. Andrew is an assistant professor at IE University in Madrid and Segovia, Spain, where he has been based since 2018. But his intellectual journey began much earlier at the University of Notre Dame, where he has graduated cum laude with dual bachelor's degree in political science and Arabic, a rare combination that signals both analytical depth and a genuine curiosity about the world. Professor Andrews' research challenges us to look at sports not as mere entertainment but as a geopolitical force. He has investigated whether international sporting competitions foster peace, how authoritarian leaders weaponize mega events for propaganda, and whether banning nations from the global sports can actually change their political behavior. His research has garnered international media attention, earning coverage by outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and publications spanning more than 20 countries. Dr. Andrew earned his PhD in political science from UC Berkeley, alongside an MA in statistics, a dual expertise that makes his research both theoretically rigorous and empirically grounded. He held postdoctoral fellowship at Dartmouth College and the University of Southern California before joining IE University. In March 2026, he released his book Beyond the Stadium: How Sports Change the World through Stanford University Press, a work that boldly challenges conventional wisdom about the role sports play in shaping society and politics. Beyond sports and geopolitics, Dr. Andrew has explored how the internet has amplified ideological polarization and how individual leaders shape the course of international conflict. In the classroom, he pushes students to develop strong data literacy and analytical thinking, skills he views as indispensable in the information age. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Dr. Andrew Bertoli, who takes us on a fascinating journey deep into the heart of his compelling new book, Beyond the Stadium: How Sports Change the World. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Bertoli to the conversation. Professor Andrew, your gracious acceptance of our invitation means a great deal to us, and it is with an immense honor and delight that we welcome you to Business Talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Professor, your book opens with a bold challenge to two dominant camps: those who dismiss sports as a mere distraction and those who romanticize them as a universal force for good. Where did both sides get it so wrong, and what made you want to write the book that corrects the records?
Right. So there are these two very popular ideas about how sports affect the world. The first is sports are just a distraction from important political and social issues. And the second is sports are this really powerful positive force for good that improve racial equality and empower women and just generally have all these really positive effects on the world. And at the heart of both of these dominant views is something that is partly true, because it is definitely the case that in some circumstances, sports can be a distraction. There are many cases in history where leaders have intentionally used sports to distract the public from political issues, and also sports sometimes sort of inadvertently end up distracting people from important social and political issues. So there's truth in that, but that idea alone, it's not enough to understand the impact of sports on society and politics, because there's all kinds of other ways that sports impact the world. And one of my favorite examples of this is comes from the book Bowling Alone, which is like one of the most important social science books published in like the last 50 years. And Bowling Alone is about social capital. The idea is there's some communities that have high levels of social capital, meaning that they have really strong connections between individuals, and there's high levels of trust. And if you're going away for a few weeks, you can ask your neighbors to watch your apartment, and you might not have to invest in, a really expensive security system or something. Communities like this have huge advantages over communities where there's low levels of social capital. And the reason bowling alone is named after a sport is because of a story of this 64-year-old man who needed a kidney transplant, and he found someone, a 33-year-old in his bowling league, who found out about a situation and decided to volunteer to give him one of his kidneys. So the idea that sports are just a distraction, well, that really misses how sports can actually um, be something that makes societies much more cohesive and brings people together and build some of these really important relationships that we can all benefit from. And that story from bowling alone it really gets into the second dominant idea about how sports affect the world, that sports are this positive force for good, right? And absolutely, sports can have some very positive effects on the world, but they're not always positive. There's a really interesting story that contrasts in a way with bowling alone. If you look at basically the bar exam in South Korea, this exam that people have to pass if they want to become like a lawyer or a prosecutor or judge. There's this very unusual pattern in the data. It's like about once every 4 years, there's an uptick in the number or in the proportion of women who pass the exam compared to men. It happens like once every 4 years. It happened in the data like over a long period of history. And what's going on in that year where there's the surprising uptick in the proportion of women who pass is that's the World Cup year. And one of the times that the exam is held, or part of the exam is held, is in the summer when the World Cup is going on. So you have a lot of men who are watching games, they're not studying, and in that way, sports are holding them back from being able to achieve their goals in life because they're too busy watching a screen, watching other people play a game instead of studying for a really important exam that they have to do. So yeah, sports can absolutely have positive effects on the world, but they can also have a number of very problematic consequences at the individual level, also at the societal level. And my book is really a call for people to think about sports in a much more critical way.
Professor, research reveals something counterintuitive that nations qualifying for the FIFA World Cup actually become more likely to initiate military conflicts. How do you explain that finding? And what does it tell us about the hidden psychological power of international competition?
Yes. So I spent about 5 years of my life studying the World Cup and its relationship to international conflict. I started this when I was doing my master's degree in statistics at Berkeley, and eventually this was like a big part of my PhD. And I discovered this very interesting sort of statistical design that's applies to the World Cup qualification process. And what I did is I compared countries that either barely qualified for the World Cup or barely missed the World Cup. So imagine Canada scored 15 points in the standings and barely qualified for the World Cup. Mexico scored 14 and barely missed. I try to take pairs of countries like that that were close, and the idea is it's almost like a coin flip. Which of those two countries goes to the World Cup? And overall, I created a sample of 142 countries. And what I found is the countries that barely qualified had this large increase in the number of militarized interstate disputes that they started. And basically, the spike happened after qualification and after the World Cup. So they were really similar before then, but then there was this big spike for the countries that barely qualified. And the data that I had, it was really interesting because the results were driven by countries where football was the most popular sport. So for a country like the United States, there was like no observable effect in the data. It was countries that really cared about football. And there's also really interesting historical examples like the football war. There's a war. It happened in 1969 that was sparked by football riots over World Cup qualification games. And it resulted in the deaths of about 2,000 people. So there's all these all these cases. The football war is the most extreme example, but there's other cases from history where there was a sporting event that caused basically military or political conflict between two countries. And so the question is why, right? Like the question is what is it about international sports that allows them to have this type of an effect? And this gets to one of the most profound insights from the sociology of sports. We were talking a minute ago about how many people think of sports just as a trivial distraction, right? They're just a game. They don't really matter. And because so many people think of sports that way, it allows them to take on very serious social and political meanings that you don't really see in that many other areas of life. So imagine you go out on the street after this conversation, and you see someone with a flag of Brazil, waving around, jumping up and down, and chanting, "Brazil's the best! Brazil's the best!" Normally, that something like that would be seen as like very strange and somewhat inappropriate in many contexts, right? But if it's happening as part of an international sporting event, it's totally normal, right? It's like a type of behavior that we expect people to do. And this gets to the core point, which it's precisely the idea that sports are trivial distractions. They're just games that don't really matter that much. That allows them to become events that are kind of celebrations of nationalism, where people get really excited and proud about their countries, that nationalism. I mean, nationalism's uh, considered by many international relations scholars to be one of the most important sources of international conflict that exists. When people are riled up and they feel really proud of their side and want to defend their side, it can make it potentially easier to get into military conflict. And so it's what we were talking about a minute ago, the idea that sports are just trivial distractions that allows them to become the site of very high levels of nationalism that you don't really see too many other places in life, and that can potentially make military conflict more likely.
Professor, one of the most startling revelations in your book is the Olympic torch relay, a symbol the world associates with unity and peace, was actually conceived by the Nazis as a tool of political domination. How did the discovery reshape your understanding of how sports symbols can be weaponized?
Sports symbols can be really powerful because so many people, when they think about sports, they have really positive images of like the best of what humans are capable of, at least in the physical realm, like the highest achievements. And because of that, the brand of sports is just incredibly strong. And sometimes we think about great sports achievements, we think about what the athletes are doing, and we associate it with things that can be political or things that aren't really so much about sports. They're just attached to the sports, and that can make them much more prestigious than they might otherwise be. And for that reason, Hitler became really interested in international sports in the mid 1930s. Initially, he didn't really care about international sports. He thought that they were, kind of a waste of time. But he had saw what Mussolini did especially with football and the 1934 World Cup, and how Mussolini had used that as just a powerful source of nationalism and a way to sort of strengthen support for his fascist regime. And Hitler thought, "Hey, we can do something very similar with the 1936 Olympics. Try to tie his brand in with the brand of like elite sports at the highest level." And it's this is something that has happened various points in history. The positive feelings we have about sports, sometimes you have a political leader with nefarious goals, in this case Hitler, trying to use that to improve their own image.
Professor, you write about a 20th century feminist movement that actually worked to keep women out of the Olympics, led by female sports leaders themselves. That is deeply counterintuitive. What were their motivations, and what does this episode reveal about the complex politics of inclusion in sports?
Well, this is a fantastic question and gets at something in the book that um, it was one of my favorite things to learn as I was working on the book. So women were heavily excluded from the Olympics for a long time. There was some participation, but not a whole lot. And a lot of that was people at the Olympics, men who didn't think it was appropriate for women to be engaged in the same type of sports that men were engaged in. And that is largely true. But there was also a group of female sports leaders who did not want women to be participating in the Olympics. And very counterintuitive, like you said. But these female sports leaders, they had a much different vision of what sports should look like. They thought basically that people should play sports for fun, exercise, and to make social connections. And elite sports, they had a lot of problems, in part for the athletes and all the commitment and all the sacrifice that had to go into being an elite athlete, and also for the fans because they were just watching other people, play games. So these female sports leaders, they wanted to teach the women who were students under them to do a number of different sports, not to take any of them too seriously, to do sports that they could keep doing like the rest of their lives as a form of exercise, as a way to make friends and build those social connections. And when the question of women at the Olympics came up, they didn't want their students to be going to the Olympics to get involved in what they saw as kind of like the male version of sports, the highly competitive, people worshiping winning and making all kinds of sacrifices to try to get really, really excellent at one particular sport. And so it wasn't just men who were keeping women out of the Olympics. It was also, this movement of female sports leaders. Uh, uh, of course, there were exceptions, but I found it interesting that there was this group of women who felt this way, and eventually they sort of lost out because as the Cold War was heating up, the Olympics became a battleground between the U.S. and the Soviets, and it was really important to both sides to do well in the medal count, and that meant women's sports in the U.S. had to become a lot more serious because in the Soviet Union, the government was taking elite women's sports extremely seriously, and that was a big disadvantage for the United States at the Olympics. So eventually, over time, the kind of the male version of sports, the very competitive model, that ended up becoming the dominant model for women's sports too. But I think there was something that those female sports leaders were right about that you know maybe just using sports for fun exercise and to make friends, that might be a really good way to use sports. Whereas the elite sports model where most people are just watching, and then you have a smaller number of people who are really, really serious about it and making all kinds of huge sacrifices to try to reach the top, that model might have a lot more problems.
Professor, perhaps the most thought-provoking argument in your book is that Michael Jordan's deliberate silence on politics may have made him the most politically impactful athlete in history. Can you walk us, our listeners, through that paradox? How does staying out of politics make you more politically influential?
Yes, it's because when athletes become involved in very controversial political issues, they can sort of polarize the public. So they may have some people who really support them, but they can also have other people who oppose what they're trying to do. And what that means is that when athletes try to take on controversial political positions, it might actually be counterproductive from the standpoint of the athletes. So they might be trying to do one thing, but they end up sort of being met with so much resistance that it ends up doing the opposite of what they want. And in the case of Michael Jordan, he was famous for wanting to stay out of politics, and because he tried to stay out of politics, he sort of ended up transcending race in some ways, being an athlete who was so popular among so many people, and race just it almost became like not even like a key part of who at least how people thought about him. They just thought Michael Jordan like best basketball player ever, and like one of the greatest athletes ever to live. There's a theory that Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods, all their athletic success sort of paved the way for many people in the United States to be more willing to elect the first Black president, Barack Obama. And I think it's important to remember here too that Obama had various ties to sports, right? So if that theory is correct, then you could potentially argue that Michael Jordan played a significant role in getting Barack Obama elected. But if Michael Jordan had become very political back in the 90s, he might have become a very polarizing figure and not had that same type of an effect on the public. So I know we live now in the age where many athletes are almost expected, maybe in some cases, or there's really a focus on athletes speaking out about controversial social and political issues. And I think the case of Michael Jordan may actually suggest that it could be better in some cases for athletes to focus on on what they're training for, what they're really good at, and that there can potentially be very positive effects of doing that too. So um, uh, you're absolutely right. It's an awesome question because that is another aspect of what I learned when I was writing the book that seemed very counterintuitive to me, but it was something that I think is an important thing to keep in mind.
Professor research with Laura Jackley and George Dean reveals a fascinating finding. Countries tend to import less from nations that defeat them at the World Cup. That is economics being shaped by a football match. How seriously should policymakers be taking sports as a variable in international trade and diplomacy?
Well, I think it can be a very important variable in some circumstances. We talked about the football war a few minutes ago, and that's one case, but there have been a variety of other cases where a sporting event has resulted in some type of controversy that becomes, some basically a political or a military or maybe a diplomatic incident between two countries. It's not super common given how often countries play each other in sports. So it when you consider all the games that are happening around the world, at like say every year, it's pretty infrequent. But if you have a particularly tense political situation and you put on a sports game that a lot of people care about, that is something that could potentially make that situation worse. And that is something that I think policymakers may want to keep in mind.
Professor, you studied whether banning countries from international sports, like the case of apartheid South Africa, can actually change political behavior. What does your research tell us about when sports sanctions work and when they are simply symbolic gestures?
Well, I'm working on this project that basically asks two questions. Why do countries get banned from international sports, and when do those bans actually get the countries to change their behavior? And basically, what we found is that countries get banned for two main reasons. The first is they broke some sports rule, and the International Sports Organization thinks that by banning them, it'll get the country to change its behavior, and it usually does. Most of these cases aren't very interesting. A country breaks a sports rule, it gets banned, and then it changes its behavior. There's a few counterexamples where a country actually refuses to change its behavior after breaking a sports rule, but normally those types of sanctions work, and they're not particularly interesting cases. The other reason that countries tend to get banned is they they do something very controversial outside of the realm of sports. Um, and there's typically, typically in these cases, the International Sports Organization doesn't want to get involved because they try to be apolitical when it comes to many of these types of political controversies. But if there's a lot of international pressure to ban the country, and if the International Sports Organization is basically facing a choice between, like, look, we're either going to ban this country or many other countries are going to boycott, then in cases like that, countries will get banned for kind of a broader political controversy. They're pretty infrequent, but the case of South Africa in the latter years of apartheid, which you mentioned, fit that category. Initially, initially, basically, South Africa was sending all white teams to international sports competitions, and that was like really controversial situation, and it got banned because of that, and this because it was over breaking a sports rule, South Africa sort of changed its behavior somewhat, and it was starting to come back into international sports. But there were many countries, especially in Africa, that said, "Look, if South Africa is going to participate while apartheid is going on, then we're not. Then we don't want to be part of the sporting event. We're going to boycott." And eventually like the IOC faced a situation where having South Africa at the Olympics would have meant many other countries would not have participated. And so when there's a situation like that, you'll get sports sanctions, and the sports sanctions aren't going to do very much to change the country's behavior because they're about a really big, important political issue. And in the case of South Africa, what really brought about change there was years of economic sanctions and eventually civil unrest that led the government eventually to democratize.
Professor Book argues that sports can build social capital and make communities feel more connected, but also divide them. What determines which outcome prevails? Is it the sports itself, the culture around it, or something else entirely?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that you've put your finger on exactly what the answer is, which is the culture around the sport. Because I think that's the most important thing. When you're in a context where people worship winning, where people care a lot about who comes out on top, I think that tends to be a much more divisive situation than when people are engaging in sports for fun and exercise and or they're watching other people play sports, but they're not taking it very seriously. They're enjoying it. They're using it as an opportunity to gather with their neighbors, maybe gather with their family and watch a game and bond over it, but they're not all caught up in the outcome. When people are a little bit more relaxed about the outcome, I think that allows sports to be something that really brings people together. But when people are really intensely focused on the outcome, maybe that'll create unity within each side, but it can definitely harden division between the two sides.
Professor, beyond the big geopolitical arguments, your book also speaks directly to individuals, families, and communities about how to better utilize sports in their own lives. What is your most practical, actionable insight for a parent deciding how to engage their child with sports?
Well, I wouldn't want to give advice to any particular parent because so much can depend on context with sports. People facing different situations. There's not like a one size fits all approach. But I'll tell you sort of how I approach sports. So I try to watch sports not too often. Okay, just because I don't think watching other people play sports is a particularly good use of my time. And if I'm going to watch sports, I might think about doing something like inviting my neighbors over or something. Use it as an opportunity to uh, bond with other people, and instead of just like watching them by myself, which is I think, I mean, it's pure entertainment, but there's not a whole lot of value I think that comes out of doing that. Um, when it when it comes to sports, though, I'm much more interested in playing sports because I think playing sports can bring a lot of value to a person's life. And my approach is I try to play a few different sports, and I try not to be too good at any of them. Okay, so almost like the philosophy of those women that we were talking about earlier, who sort of opposed elite sports. Because if you're doing a few different sports, you're going to get more variety of motion by doing that, and you're probably going to be a lot less susceptible to overuse injuries. There's also something called the sports specific paradox. And it's the idea that trying to become really good at one sport might actually not be so good for your body because it can create physical imbalances within your body. And it strikes me as potentially not a great idea when people like really try to focus on one sport and say, hey, I'm gonna try to become like the best in my city, or the best in my area at this particular sport. I think it's much healthier for people to do a variety of different sports and just try to get pretty good at the sports that you're doing. I would also say that for me, there's kind of like a hierarchy of sports. Not all sports are created equal. So I try to stay away from any sports that might involve head injury. Uh, I like your mind is your most valuable asset, in my opinion. And I think anything that could be causing long-term brain damage, you want to be really careful about that. Also, sports that involve more variety of motions. These are these are especially sports involving balls. Those can be really good both for your body because you're going to have to do many different types of motion and your mind. So like one thing I've read is ping pong is like a very good sport for the mind because your mind has to keep track of where the ball is going. So generally sports that don't involve head injury and involve balls are, I think, pretty good sports. And there's some sports that I think a lot of people think are really good, but maybe aren't quite as beneficial as they're advertised. So anything that's a very limited range of motion, this could be like cycling, where the motion that you have is like very limited in terms of what your feet are doing, or running, especially like running on a treadmill. It's like very monotonous. And swimming has some of this too because the motions in swimming are so repetitive. I try to stay away from sports like that because I just think like doing the same motion over and over is not a great, probably not great for long-term health, and can lead to various types of injuries and imbalances in the body. And the last thing I'd say is any sports that are dangerous, where there's like a realistic chance you could die, I would stay far away from those. Things like big wave surfing comes to my mind. I'm fascinated by it, but I sort of can't believe that we glorify it in the way that we do, because I see like how dangerous it can be, and I think it might be better if just nobody tries to go out there and ride really big waves. And other sports that like free diving, I think is potentially a really bad sport that could result in someone dying a lot earlier than they should. So uh, obviously you want safe sports, I think, things that don't involve head injury and things that give you a variety of motions. That's at least how I think about sports for myself.
Professor Andrew, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. As AI, data analytics, and global media continue to reshape the sports industry, do you see sports becoming even more politically and socially potent in the decades ahead? Or are there forces that could actually diminish that influence? What does the future of sports and society look like for you?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and it's a question that I think about a lot. I don't talk about it too much in my book, but I mean I think it's the future, and so I've thought about it quite a bit, and I think that with AI, there's the potential for people to have a lot more free time. Like if AI is doing a lot of the monotonous work that we used to do, that can now be automated way more easily, then maybe that means people have more free time. And that could mean that people spend a lot more time engaging in sports, whether they're watching sports or they're playing sports. And so one question I have is, if we're going to have a lot more free time in the future, how are we going to engage with sports differently? Are we going to be part of various sports leagues and meeting lots of people and getting exercise in and building social connections, or are people just going to be staring at their TVs or staring at their computers, watching other people play games? So I think that's one of the big questions. If AI ends up giving us a lot more free time, is how are we going to use that time when it comes to sports? I also think it's possible that AI is going to greatly reduce production costs in terms of like broadcasting sporting events, and that could potentially make it so it's just way easier to watch like whatever sport you might be interested in, even if it's not a particularly uh, popular sports, if it's something that you like. So that could potentially mean that we're not all watching the same sports as much. So if that's the case, then maybe we have less of these moments, like with the World Cup that's about to happen, where much of the world's going to be watching at least some of the World Cup and being able to talk about it and having it like as a shared experience. Well, if there's just a lot more options of what people watch in the future, it could make it harder to have those shared moments that in a way bring us all together.
Professor Andrew, this conversation has been nothing short of eye-opening. You have shown us that sports are never just games. They are mirrors of our politics, our values, and our deepest human instincts. Thank you for sharing your remarkable insights from beyond the stadium, how sports change the world, with our listeners today. It has been a truly privilege to have you with us today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you, and yeah, just found your questions to be excellent. So thank you very much.